I will now talk about some of the main critiques of utilitarianism. John Rawls was one of the major philosophers of the 20th century, and he thought and wrote about what a just society would look like. And he argued that a just society is what everybody would agree to if they were free to argue whatever they liked, if they were rational, they were capable of arguing, and if they were impartial. And in order to get to that impartiality, he introduced the so-called veil of ignorance, where essentially it's a thought experiment and he takes everybody out of society and then let them argue about what a just society would look like if they would not know what their position in that society would be, what their skill set would be, and what their attitude towards society and their risk aversion and those sort of things would be. And he argued that if you do not know what you will be or who you would be in society, only then you can be impartial about what that society would look like. Conducting that thought experiment, he argued that a just society would have maximum liberty, that is, people should be left to do whatever they want, provided they do not infringe on other people's liberties. So that's a very libertarian position. But at the same time, he also argued that society would only be just if everybody would have the same resources at their disposal. And there would only be two exceptions to that. One is a Pareto principle, that if there's a resource difference that makes everybody better off without making anybody worse off, then that would be a good thing. So that is one justification for people earning different incomes. And the other, if it were to be attached to position. And the reasoning behind that is something as follows, that a doctor or a firefighter has to be available 24/7 in case of emergency, whereas people with other professions do not need to do that. I'm a professor, I work from 9 till 5, or I'm available to my students between 9 and 5. And therefore, because doctors make that sacrifice and firefighters make that sacrifice and nurses make that sacrifice, they need to be properly rewarded for that, otherwise they would not do that. And that would call for a higher income for doctors, but also for nurses. Rawls may argue that doctors would earn more than nurses because they need to study longer, 8 years rather than 3 or 4 years. But that is a small difference, and that would not justify the large difference in income between doctors and nurses, according to Rawls. And this is a very different position than a utilitarian position would, as you can imagine. But people nonetheless often interpret Rawls in a utilitarian way, and essentially says that what government should do is maximize the utility not of the sum total of the people in a society, but rather the utility of the worst off. It's unclear whether Rawls would have accepted that interpretation. Another thing that Rawls never said, but some people have said, is that you can actually expand his reasoning of the veil impartiality to not knowing what time you would live in society. And then you also have a concept of intergenerational utility or intergenerational justice. Rawls never talked about these things, but that is how some people have extended his work. There's other criticism of utilitarianism. I mentioned two schools of moral philosophy, naturalism and libertarianism. I did not talk about sentimentalism. Essentially says you should not reason, you should just follow your gut feeling. Those are obvious criticisms of utilitarianism. There's people who do not like utilitarianism because of the conclusions that it reaches. But there's also more profound critiques, mostly associated with Amartya Sen, who you see pictured here. And the first critique of utilitarianism is that utility is just too narrow a concept, that there's more to life than just material well-being. And a utilitarian would, for instance, defend the government of Singapore, which is fairly authoritarian, but at the same time delivers a high standard of living to its citizens. The people, or Taiwan and South Korea, were for a long time governed in much the same way as Singapore still is, but the people of those countries rejected that. They wanted political freedoms as much as they wanted material well-being. And the people of Hong Kong are also relatively well-to-do, but do not seem to be too keen on the authoritarianism imposed on them from Beijing. So there's more to life than what you can measure in terms of material well-being. And this is not just a measurement issue, because the notion of democratic rights or freedom is not something that you as an individual have, but it is a characteristic of the society in which you live. And therefore it cannot fit into a utility function, because a utility function is a function of the stuff that you have, not of the properties of the system in which you live. And same goes for second main issue, and that is that in a classic representation of utility, what matters there is your own well-being. People are assumed to be atoms that do not interact with others. But there's obviously such things as responsibility, there's obviously such things as altruism. And that does not fit easily into a utility function at all, because then essentially your utility depends on the utility or your perceived utility of the people around you. And there's two problems with that. One is a technical one. If utilities are interdependent, if my well-being depends on your well-being, then you can no longer aggregate our demand functions, because the aggregation that we do in micro assumes that our demand functions are independent of each other, otherwise you can't aggregate them in the way we do. So that's a technical objection. There's a way around it, but it gets hairy pretty quickly. But there's also, and more importantly, there is a public economics issue there as well. Namely, that if we count as individual utility how other people view us, the altruism part, then the upshot is that people who others feel altruistic towards are receiving a higher rate, which is not what you want a social welfare function to look like. Essentially what you say is that people who have lots of friends or lots of family, and therefore have lots of people in whose utility function their utility pops up, those people should count more if the social welfare function is some aggregate of individual utility, whereas people who are loners, who don't have any friends, who don't have any family, should not count as much as people who do. And that's not an argument that a government would want to make. And then the third thing that Sen wrote about is agency, and that's more the descriptive critique of utilitarianism, and that is that in different situations we behave differently. Even if you're the same person, you behave differently. You are different as a son or a daughter than as a sibling, or if you're with your old school friends, or with your colleagues at university, or with your colleagues at work. You behave differently. Now that immediately suggests that utilitarianism is just a bad description of human behavior. And that goes for many things. If you see a middle-aged man chatting up a young woman in a bar, you think that he's a sad loser and that he's out of his league. If you see a middle-aged male professor chat up a young female student, you don't think these thoughts. You think in terms of abuse of power and those sort of things. So what role people assume depends on how they behave and how we judge that behavior. And of course, judging people's behavior is what the social welfare function is all about. And therefore, if you introduce issues of agency, the notion that the same person behaves and is expected to behave differently in different contexts completely messes up anything you can think about the social welfare function should do. And that's a valid criticism of utilitarianism.